Well, I don't think climbers necessarily make good mental training coaches, because I think what they found that works for them is not necessarily going to work for other people. Is like, this is sort of like the way you see this, but it doesn't really fit with like any sports psychology or anything. Whereas like I think on the physical side of it, like most pro climbers are going to have a fairly decent knowledge of like the physiology around training, for example. I think like fear of failure is probably the thing that limits pros the most. Because I think like with fear of falling and stuff, you probably had to have managed that to some level to get as good as they are.
Sure.
But fear of failure, you can actually achieve a lot and be crippled with fear of failure, and actually can be really like extrinsically motivated, and still achieve a lot. But whether that's good for your mental health is another question.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is it because they've attained so much, they now feel like they have so much to lose? Or is it the imposter syndrome, in a sense, like you brought up earlier, that was something that, you've struggled with at times? Why uniquely for these elite climbers is fear of failure kind of the top spot?
Well, if you think about it, these people have achieved a lot, and achievements feel good, and they can become addictive. The feeling you get when you achieve something does not last that long. I just climbed like my hardest sport route this year, and people come up to me who've not seen me, and they're like, "Oh, well done on your route," and I'm literally like, "What route?" Do you know what I mean? Like, it just really doesn't last. So we're always chasing that next thing, and so if you value the end more than the process, basically you in this constant state of needing to achieve again and again and again to kind of feel good about yourself and to have your ego satisfied, and to also like there's people who expect you to achieve, right? Like your sponsors, the people who follow you on Instagram. What are you going to post on Instagram if you haven't achieved anything in the last few months? So there's all these pressures, right, which make the prospect of not achieving, which is the same as failure, right? It makes it a thing to fear, this state of not living up to the expectations of others, not living up to what is required of you by your sponsors. That's scary, and it's scarier for a pro climber than it is for a normal climber, I think, because you aren't, as an average middle of the road climber, you're not expected to be as good as a pro climber.
All right, y'all, just a quick shout out for today's sponsor, which is PhysiVantage Nutrition. This is their new pomegranate berry flavored collagen. Oh my gosh, it's so good. I've been a paying customer for years, y'all, because this stuff works. All right, it helps me to train harder, recover faster, and perform at my best. It's kept my fingers injury free as I've been training hard. And don't just take my word for it. Check out their pro team. From Alex Magos to Natalia Grossman and Jonathan Segrist and Daniel Woods, so many pros are using PhysiVantage on the reg to level up. I think you're going to love it. Hit that link below. Use code STRUGGLE at checkout for 15% off and give it a shot. Let's get back to the show.
That said, I think that a lot of climbers, even climbers who are not pros, really struggle with fear of failure because we're very, very social creatures, and we really like to feel kind of praise from our peers, and we tend to put ourselves in like hierarchies with our friends. And so like if your friend comes along and does a route and you usually climb better than them, then there's all this pressure to climb it too, because if you don't, then people will think you're a worse climber. We're very wrapped up in thinking like that, and we're often very unaware of it as well. And there's loads of research around this that's super interesting. But basically, like, we're very socially motivated, and we have big egos. All of us do. No matter how zen you think you are, you've got an ego. And so, yeah, that if we achieved to protect our ego, and in the absence of that, we fear failure. So I think it affects most of us, to be honest. There's only a few people I meet who seem to be completely immune to it, and I'm so jealous of them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, first of all, it makes a lot of sense. If you're a professional, then I would understand that it would be quite common that a lot of your identity that you've created for yourself, your ego and maybe your self-worth are going to be wrapped up in how you perform. Whereas for, people like myself, weekend warriors, maybe the stakes aren't as high as with the elites, but we still experience this same fear.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I coach loads of people who are not pro climbers and who really struggle with fear of failure, and real kind of deep fear of failure ends up being a self-worth issue usually.
Mm-hmm.
And so what usually is the case is that you tend to fuel your sense of self-worth with climbing achievements. So you basically just feel like you have very little self-worth and self-confidence. You really don't think of yourself as a very good person unless you achieve these arbitrary things in climbing. And it's a very unhealthy place to be, and it causes a lot of unhappiness in climbing. And so as a coach, it's about trying to find sources of self-worth that are not tied to performance. That's the kind of like the key thing to do there.
What would be an example with regard to fear of failure then? And obviously it's so highly individualized because you're talking, one-to-one to clients. And so I'm sorry if this is like an impossible task, but maybe you could give some sort of example of what that would mean, maybe for a pro climber and maybe for, just an amateur kind of weekend warrior type.
Yeah, so I think my go-to with fear of failure is really to redefine what failure means to the individual. Like, for example, when I did Magic Line, so I call it a metric of success or metric of failure. So how do we measure failure? How do we measure success? And our standard conception of failure is like, we don't do the route. And the standard conception of success is we do the route. But what if your metric of failure was you fail if you don't keep trying, or you don't try hard, or you don't stay positive with the process? So when I went to do Magic Line, like my main goal was to stay present and positive with the process of trying the route. That was like my primary goal, the primary thing that I wanted to get from the trip. And my secondary goal was to complete the climb. Now you might think, oh, that sounds a bit silly because like obviously you want to do this route. But it helped me climb better. I knew that having my attention more focused on the primary goal of staying present and positive was actually going to allow me to drop into my best performances. Whereas if I'd gone, oh, I'm only here to send the route. If I don't, the whole trip's wasted. There's no learning or value in this process unless I send the route. My attention is always at the end. It's at the end point, at the end goal. And then I'm not present with the process anymore. So for me, I personally, and this is what I do with the people I coach, is try to change what failure means to someone. So like if someone might come to me, for example, with a bit of fear of falling and a bit of fear of failure, maybe their metric of success would be to work on their fear of falling in their session. So it's not to get to the top. Then that relieves some of that pressure. And if they fall off, it's a win because they're going to be working on their fear of falling. And they've relieved some of that fear of failure as well. So basically, it's like a mindset which is driven by learning and good performances rather than outcomes and achievements.